This is a 2001 Bentley Azure, and it's ridiculous. This car has only 2 doors and small back seats, and yet it's 1.5 feet longer than a Volvo XC90 family SUV. That's because this car was not about practicality. Instead, it was about peak 1990s over-the-top excess and opulence. And it was owned by peak 1990s celebrity Jean Claude Van Damme. Today, I'm going to review this Bentley Azure and show you all of its quirks and features. Before I get started, big news, this Bentley Azure belongs to HOOVIE'S garage, and it's currently for sale, being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. This Azure is ridiculous, crazy, over the top, and yes, it really was owned by Jean Claude Van Damme, and HOOVIE'S offering it on Cars and Bids with no reserve. So, once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to head over to the live auction for HOOVIE'S Bentley, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. Alright, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the HOOVIE'S garage Jean Claude Van Damme Bentley Azure with a little overview of exactly what this vehicle is. So, the Azure was based on the Bentley Continental, but not the Continental that we know today. Back in the early 90s, the Bentley Continental was this big, huge coupe, well, basically a coupe version of this car. And Bentley decided they wanted a convertible model, and so they created the Azure with one little problem. It was harder than they thought. Harder to engineer, harder to create, and especially harder to build. And Bentley didn't have the capacity or the expertise to actually manufacture this vehicle. So the Azure first debuted in 1995, and it was built by Pininfarina in Italy. They had the production know-how to turn this car into a convertible and to build it, and so that's what happened. Not really the most British Bentley with the Italian build. The result was an ultra-opulent luxury convertible that just screamed obscene wealth, and it was huge. These cars weighed 5,900 pounds, almost 3 tons for a 2-door convertible. And yes, it's 1.5 feet longer than a Volvo XC90, even though that is a 3-row family SUV that came out 20 years later. This 2-door convertible is bigger. Now, all the Azure models used Bentley's 6 3/4 liter V8, like most Bentley and Rolls-Royce models did at this time, but owing to this car's huge size, it was turbocharged here. Initially, it made about 360 horsepower, but by 2001, by this car, it was about 390 horsepower and about 550 pound-feet of torque. Now, I say about because back then, Bentley and Rolls-Royce didn't quote actual figures for their horsepower and torque. They didn't want to get into numbers comparisons with other cars. That wasn't the purpose of a Bentley or Rolls-Royce. It wasn't about horsepower ratings and 0 to 60 times. It was about the feeling you got as you drove the car. And so journalists at the time had to actually measure the horsepower to try to get approximate numbers. Now, all of these Azure models were rear-wheel drive, and they all used a 4-speed automatic transmission that was sourced from General Motors. And despite all of the crazy stuff I just told you, the craziest might be the price tag. Brand new in 2001, this car had a base price of $340,000. A base price before options 20 years ago, 340 grand. A huge number, but then Jean Claude Van Damme didn't care. He went down to the Bentley dealer, bought one, and cruised around looking cool and rich. Now, despite its massive price tag and its massive size, the Azure was reasonably popular, at least by Bentley's standards of the day, which isn't saying much. They were always flirting with bankruptcy in this period, but Bentley made 1,400 of these between 1995 and 2003, 8-year production run. Doesn't sound like a lot, and it isn't, but it was enough that Rolls-Royce wanted to get in on it too. Back then, Rolls-Royce and Bentley were the same company, and they mostly just made versions of each other's cars. So Rolls decided decided they wanted a version of this, and from 99 to 02, they sold the Corniche, which was a full-size Rolls-Royce convertible version of the Azure, and they made another 380 of those during that 4-year run. Now, when this version of the Azure went out of production after 2003, Bentley did redesign it. And they created a next generation Azure, but it came just as the economy was slowing down in the recession. Nobody wanted giant convertibles, and it wasn't popular. And they eventually canceled it in favor of the Continental GTC, which was more popular and more manageably sized. It was a lot more desirable for most people. But anyway, next let's move on to the many quirks and features of the Azure, starting with the door, which is absolutely massive. Of course it is. This is a massive vehicle, and the door has to be big enough to provide access to front and rear seats. So it's huge and it's heavy. You can't see this on camera, obviously, but this is an incredibly heavy door owing to its size and also the materials. Tons of leather and wood all add up to make this door almost unwieldy and difficult to open. And there are many interesting things in the door area, starting with 2 interior door handles. You can see one is further up on the inside and the second one is further back. That's for rear passengers. If they want to climb out, the person in front isn't opening the door, they don't have to wait. They have their own dedicated door handle to open up the door so they can climb out. You don't see that on too many cars. Also interesting in the door panel, you can see the window switches. They're arranged here, but they're in a line and completely unlabeled. So you don't really know which switch controls which window. That was part of the mystique of the Azure. Now, another interesting thing in the door, you open it up and there's a plaque on the door sill that mentions this is a special edition from Rolls-Royce of Beverly Hills. Not Bentley of Beverly Hills. Like I mentioned, they were the same company back then, but this was a special 1 of 5 edition of this car. Now, what made it special? I don't think anything. I think they just stuck those plaques in there to try to sell some cars, and it worked with Jean Claude Van Damme. Now, speaking of plaques in the door sill, you have another one here. You can see this kind of cool metal plaque that says Bentley and shows this car's serial number, and also in this area, another label that says Azure. As if there was any confusion, you knew exactly what you were in with this tiny label in the door jamb. And next we move inside the Azure, where there are many more interesting quirks and features, starting with the seats. You can see they look fairly normal until you get to the headrest. There's just one pillar on the side of the seat that props the headrest up in place. They did that for the seat belts. They had to integrate a 3-point seat belt into this car, but they couldn't use the roof to mount it because it's a convertible, and so you have this weird seat pillar. You can see that design repeats itself over on the passenger side, just of the pillar on the opposite side to support the seat belt over there. Now, also unusual with the seats is the controls, which are in the center. They are shaped like a seat, like in most cars, but mounted in the center console. Below that, you have seat memory, 3 different settings, even though these buttons could clearly accommodate a 4th setting. They just decided, nah, we're good. And you also have your seat heater control here as well, this little switch that you can turn 1 or 2 or off. Now, the seat controls being in the center is certainly unusual, and it's the beginning of a lot of very strange controls that this car has. Directly next to the seat controls, you have these 2 little silver joysticks. They control your side mirrors individually. Instead of one joystick with a little switch for both mirrors, you got 2 individual joysticks, which just added cost and complication, but they didn't really care. They figured people would pay it. Also unusual in the center console is the gear selector. There's no button that you push to move it between gears. Instead, you lift up the entire selector and then you can go between your gears. To go into sport mode, you press this little button marked S in the middle, and that was sporty driving in the Azure. But the really weird controls came in the center control stack. There were a series of switches and buttons that are just bizarre. Starting with the one marked roof, you would think that that would control the convertible roof, but in fact it doesn't. Instead, it turns on a reading light mounted at the top of the windshield. That is what the roof button does. To actually control the convertible roof, you had to switch over on the other side of this panel marked hood, which in British English means roof. Hood, like American hood, is bonnet. It's all rather confusing if you're driving this car in the States. But anyway, that switch controls the top, and the process is tremendously interesting. It is rather violent and rather loud. Well, take a look. So that is ridiculous, but we're not done with the ridiculousness of the controls in this car just yet. One of my very favorites is a button with like a little oil lamp on it. It has a tremendously unusual function. You go up a little higher and you can see the fuel level, the fuel gauge. That's a pretty standard gauge, but in the middle of it, there's something that says min oil. This car survives on mineral oil, which is used to power some of the systems throughout this vehicle. And if you want to know if your mineral oil level is low, you simply press the oil button in the center control stack, and then the fuel gauge temporarily displays your mineral oil level instead of your fuel level. You release the oil button, and then this gauge goes back to displaying your fuel level. So it has a second purpose if you press that button. Very strange. I also love the fuel door button, which doesn't have an image of a fuel door on it, but instead it says refuel. And you press this, the fuel door opens as if you could refuel by simply pushing a button. And how about changing the climate control temperature? There's no little screen with a temperature readout. Instead, you have these dials that you just move. Red is hot, blue is cold, and you sort of move them around depending on whether you're too hot or too cold. That was your temperature control in this car. However, the craziest of all these buttons is undoubtedly the horn. This does not turn on the horn, but instead it changes the tone. Take a listen to the horn. Okay, now I press this horn button in the center console. Take a listen to the horn again. You hear the different horn notes. This car has what's called a town and country horn, and that meant you were out in the country driving faster, you needed a horn that could project longer distances, so one of those horn notes is for that. But then you're in the city and you just want to beep lightly at someone who's backing up. You don't want to sound to everyone miles around, so you turn on the town horn, and it's a softer, smaller note for around town driving, a town and country horn. Anyway, moving up from this center control stack buttons, you have this pod of gauges in the middle of the dashboard. These are all the gauges you'd expect. There's a clock in here, but also oil pressure, voltage meter, fuel, that sort of thing. The weird part is this red button in the center. Plastic, looks totally out of place, does not belong in this fine aluminum and wood gauge cluster. Interestingly, that is your starter button for this car, but you still had to insert a key. This car came out in the early 2000s when buttons for starting was becoming cool, but they didn't have proximity keys yet. So you would get in, you would insert the key over on the left side, as you can see, twist it, that would turn on the accessories, and then from there you would press the giant red button in the center to start it up, a very un-Bentley-like startup procedure. And while the key placement is certainly unusual to the left of the steering wheel, even stranger is the cruise control and wiper placement. Cruise control is on a stalk coming off the steering column, as you can see. The windshield wipers were actually on the dashboard to the right of the steering column, as you can see here. A lot of times cars will flip those since you use the cruise control typically less than the wipers, but that's not what they did here for whatever reason. Now, also worth mentioning here in the steering wheel vicinity is the gauge cluster, which looks like a fairly traditional normal gauge cluster, except in the center you had this little screen panel that had many different colors on it. You can see them all when I start it up. All these warning lights had all sorts of different colors. These are the days before functional LCD screens could just tell you what was wrong, so you had these little warning lights in different colors to show you if you looked down and saw. But also worth pointing out in this area, the steering wheel. You can see it's finished in this beautiful blue with these cream accents on the top and the bottom. I believe they called this magnolia, and this color scheme is repeated all throughout this car. The seats are magnolia with gorgeous blue piping. Same thing with the dashboard. This cream magnolia and blue looks very nice. And generally speaking, the materials in this car are gorgeous. You have high quality wood all throughout with these nice leather trimming. Everything in here was nice. Well, it should have been for $350,000. Interestingly, there was one odd form of cost cutting. Open up the glove box and you can see the owner's manual pouch is shared between Rolls-Royce and Bentley. Like I said, at this time they were the same company, but rather than just give Bentleys a Bentley owner's manual and Rolls a Rolls manual, they decided to combine them in some bizarre attempt to save a few dollars per car in one of the most opulent vehicles of its day, which is very strange. Also a little strange is the way the hood opens. You go into the driver's footwell like in most cars, but it's not this. That's the parking brake release. Instead, the hood release is over on the right side, sort of in the middle of everything. You pull on it and it doesn't just pop out, it comes out all the way and stays there as long as the hood is open. Once it's out, the hood has been released and then you can open it up. It's front hinged, which is odd. When you close the hood and it latches down, it automatically closes up that hood release in the driver's footwell. It's a bit of an unusual process. And next up, we move on to the back seat in the Azure, which also has some unusual touches. To get back here, you just fold the front seat forward and then it moves up for you and you can climb back inside and enjoy the back seat. Now, it's not huge back here, but it's also not that small. You got some decent space to sit back here and enjoy life in the back of the Azure. And you have some interesting features, one of which is a power window. There are rear windows in this car, but most convertibles don't give rear passengers access to them, but here you have it. So if you decide everyone else in the car wants the top down, but it's just not feeling like a top down day to you, well, forget you, people. I'm gonna sit back here with my window up. Now, like I mentioned, you also have a door handle back here for rear seat passengers, so you can easily open up the door, which is kind of a cool feature to have in back. And, well, there's this nice little storage cubby with a nice aluminum latch. You can open it up and store little items back here, I guess, if you want to. Of course, you also have an ashtray and a cigarette lighter because obviously you do in a vehicle like this. And you have a rather unusual feature that I'm not sure I've ever seen before. These seat belts built into the middle of the rear seat. You're thinking, what is that doing there? The purpose is to let you buckle the buckles into the seat, and that way they're not flailing around as you drive. I guess if you want that really perfect luxury car experience with no creaks or rattles anywhere, even the rear belt buckles, you can buckle them in, and then you never have to listen to them move around. That is luxury. And so is this. And finally, we move on to the trunk of the Azure, or the boot, as it's called. On the button in the inside, you can press to release it. That's one way to get back here. The other is kind of clever. You flip up the Bentley B and the winged Bentley logo, and you can see a keyhole. Insert the key, twist it, and you can open up the boot. And when you do open it up, you'll notice, well, it's actually not particularly interesting. You have the same blue and magnolia pattern back here as you do inside. Here it's nice carpeting, nice leather piping, more luxurious than a regular trunk, but it is indeed still a trunk. In fact, the only interesting thing back here is that the fuel filler is back here. You can see the fuel cap here. You untwist it, and that's where you put in fuel, gasoline, petrol, whatever you want to call it. Now, you don't have to open the trunk in order to do that. You can see trunk closed. There's a little door, and I showed you before that refuel button will pop open the door, and then you can fill it up. But aside from that, you got a trunk in your Azure. And finally, I want to talk about the exterior design of the Azure, which isn't what I would call beautiful, but instead it's created to evoke the most presence that it possibly can. This massive, long vehicle doesn't have flowy, curvy lines, which was the style of the 90s. Instead, big slab sides and a giant upright grille, just to let everybody know that a big baller is in town with a big Bentley. Indeed, this car recalled some of the luxury cruisers of the 1920s and 30s, giant vehicles, often chauffeur-driven, that just oozed presence. And the big convertible is a segment that's pretty much gone away. Nobody really wants cars like this anymore. Nobody really buys them. This was one of the last big luxury, look-at-me, obscene wealth convertibles to ever exist, and it plays the part quite well. At least it did for Jean Claude Van Damme. All right, driving the HOOVIE'S garage / Jean Claude Van Damme Bentley Azure. Here's a story for you. I worked at Bentley of Denver back when this car was not new but close. It was 2008, so just gone out of production. And we had one that we had sold new for $390,000. And the person came back to trade it in. I don't remember what the number was, but he came back to trade it in like 3 years later, and they offered him like $160,000, some ridiculously low amount of money, because these cars depreciated so unbelievably fast. So then again, the guy probably never paid $390,000 either. That was the sticker price. He probably got like 60 grand off initially just so they could move it. So let's talk about this car. The main thing that comes to mind when I drive this vehicle is old school. This doesn't feel like a car from the modern era in some senses. And by that I mean, obviously this big, long size, like this almost feels like an old 70s Eldorado or something like that. This has the old school, big cruiser car feel to it that they just don't make anymore for a lot of reasons. But it isn't just that makes this car feel so deeply old school. Yes, it's got a turbo V8 with almost 400 horsepower, but the way power builds in this car, it isn't fast. It just like, eventually you'll get there where you need to go. Now the car actually has good torque. So you floor it, I'm going 60 and I step on it. It does move pretty well, but there's no like crazy urgency to it. You have this sort of slow, lazy General Motors transmission, and you have good power in this car, but mostly it's just torque. It's enough to get this thing moving, get it going, good momentum, but not to like, you don't like fly around like in some sort of sports car. That's not the purpose here. Now, the other thing about this car that you notice as you drive it is it just floaty. Like I said, big car and it has that feel, but also just like the steering inputs. I mean, you got 6-7 inches of turning the steering wheel as I'm doing right here when nothing occurs. I mean, it was just this vastly over boosted steering to just give you this sense that it was so easy to turn. And there's no precision. And when you go around a corner, my God, the body roll, this car just leans. There's no hustling this car. It didn't want to hustle. It was 6,000 pounds. It wanted you to sit in it and just sort of cruise and look down on everybody else. And that's what the people who drove this car did. There is not a whole lot of like fun thrill to driving this car, except for the fact that you are driving this car, that it's cool and exciting and interesting and kind of awesome. That makes this car special. The actual driving experience was just sort of subdued and luxurious. And interestingly, the ride quality is not as amazing as I would think it is. This particular car has almost 69,000 miles, which could play a role. Stuff gets worn, all that. But it doesn't feel as like pillowy soft as you associate with Bentley and Rolls-Royce now. It's nice, but it's not like as nice as I was kind of expecting given, the original price point. Now with that said, I will say it's quite quiet inside this car. You don't hear a lot of the goings on outside. I got a diesel truck going by right now, literally hear none of that. That's pretty impressive for a car with a soft top, especially in the one that was developed in the mid-90s and built in part by the British and in part by the Italians. This car is like a nice luxury vehicle, and it does have a nice luxury presence to it, but You know, it's just this old school car for people who just want to relive the great Gatsby era where, you know, people had these big opulent look at me vehicles. That's this, and it's surprising to see it in the modern world. Like, it doesn't fit in the modern world, but there's a certain subset of people for whom, you know, this was sort of the pinnacle of luxury, and it is still very cool, very special. I still go crazy when I see an Azure. Holy crap, take pictures, send to my friends. It's that type of car because it's tremendously rare, and it's definitely symbolic of a totally different mindset than today's world of, you know, eat the rich, kind of subdue your wealth. That was not the case with this car. And so that's the HOOVIE'S Garage 2001 Bentley Azure. This is an over-the-top, ridiculous car that's absurd in the most grandiose and opulent way. And it's hilarious to check it out and spend the day with it. And if it's good enough for Jean Claude Van Damme, it can be good enough for you on Cars and Bids. Anyway, now it's time to give this Bentley a DougScore.
And the DougScore is here, 51 out of 100, which places the Azure here against some other similar big luxury cars from this era. The Azure is interesting. It's not especially fun to drive, and it's not as relaxed and luxurious as I expected, but it has more presence than basically anything on this list, even the newer Azure. If you want to arrive somewhere in utter head-turning, over-the-top style, the Azure does it, but it'll be slow, ponderous, and costly to own as well. Just don't tell that to the people who stare as you go by.